Hello, and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm your host, Kanika Kaur, a research analyst at the Institute. India and China share a long, largely undefined Himalayan border, and tensions have remained high since the violent military clash in July 2020. Since then, both nations have fortified their positions, deploying additional troops and equipment across the border. While more than several rounds of military and diplomatic talks have taken place to address the conflict, the progress has been slow, until recently. Following Narendra Modi's re-election in June 2024, a new round of negotiations has sparked optimism for a long overdue solution. According to the External Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, 75% of military disengagement issues have now been addressed, signaling a significant breakthrough. To help us unpack these developments, we're joined today by Professor Kanti Bajpai, the Vice Dean of Research and Development and the Wilmar Professor of Asian Studies at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Thank you for joining me today, Professor.
Morning. Thanks a lot.
Okay, to begin our discussion, I wanted to start with a question on border security and what Professor thinks are India's critical military objectives in the current re-escalation talks with China, and if you think these concerns are being adequately addressed.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's a complicated one because both sides are not terribly transparent about exactly where their military deployments are. And that includes India. I mean, I think there have been a lot of concerns on the Indian side about transparency. Now, of course, up there in the border, you can't be completely transparent, even to your own public. But I think there are still a lot of questions about exactly where Chinese troops have come to what extent they've gone beyond levels and deployments prior to the Galwan conflict of the summer of 2020. And so it's a bit hard to know exactly what India's military objectives are on the ground. But what we can say is that India's held firm to a position that the two sides should go back to the status quo ante prior to June of 2020. So conceptually, that's what India wants. It wants China back to where things were before the ugly confrontation in May, June, and July of 2020. But again, I mean, since we don't know exactly what those positions were prior to the conflict, it's hard to know exactly on the ground what that would mean. And again, so are these concerns being adequately addressed? The Foreign Minister Jaishankar says that 75% of India's kind of goals have been addressed. Again, since we don't know exactly what the situation is on the ground, it's hard to know. I mean, one would just have to take it on face value since he's a responsible member of the Indian government. It's very hard for people outside of government to know exactly what's going on there. I mean, let's hope for the best. And I think the optimistic statements at least are some signs that both sides are making concessions.
Okay, that's very interesting. The themes of non-transparency and the lack of trust between the two countries, and also governments also not being very transparent with their domestic audience about what their goals are in the region. So just on that, I'll follow up on the lack of transparency later as well. But just on the domestic aspect, I was wondering if we could also talk about how, with the diminished power that Prime Minister Modi has in 2024 with the re-election, as well as the opposition criticizing his handling of China, with Rahul Gandhi going ahead and saying that this is not being handled well, or he's being pushed over, and much of his base seeing China as an adversity. Do you think that this kind of domestic political pressure could also influence or maybe shape his stance in the border talks, or potentially become an obstacle?
I think the answer to your question is both yes and no. On the one hand, clearly, since Mr. Modi received a setback in the elections, his hands are more tied. He's more answerable. The opposition has become enlivened, led by Rahul Gandhi. So in that sense, I mean, there are probably more constraints. And I think, there were some signals that Mr. Modi might have wanted to do something more dramatic with China after the elections if he'd won a considerable mandate. For instance, his interview, I think, with the Financial Times indicated sort of an olive branch to China, saying China was a very important country for India, and India looked forward to a better relationship with China. And I think there were some signs that perhaps Mr. Modi might have done something quite dramatic with China if he'd come back with a big majority. So to that extent, I think post-election scenario suggests that he won't have as free a hand. Having said that, on the other hand, the domestic situation and the growing constraints on him, oddly enough, ironically, give him some degree of greater sort of bargaining power with Beijing. When Beijing pushes him on stuff related to the border, he can always say that, his hands are tied now with the domestic opposition and his weakened position. So, these things are quite complex. There are contradictory kind of opportunities and constraints as a result of the elections. Much will depend on really how activist he estimates the Indian opposition to be. I say this because traditionally, despite what Rahul Gandhi has been saying recently and some other leaders on China, generally the opposition is pretty understanding on foreign policy and lets the government of the day, whoever it is, a fairly free hand. And I think we should remember also that the left of center opposition, including the Congress, has generally been more pragmatic and more businesslike with China and wants to have a decent relationship with China. So I think Modi, has both constraints, but he also has some space to operate with China. It's hard to know exactly where he would come out, but I think, I wouldn't say that Mr. Modi is altogether weakened by the election results. He's still got some room for maneuver with China. I think the truest statement we can make is that, at times Mr. Modi and his team might emphasize that their hands are tied, they can't make concessions to China. At other times, he may signal that, he's got a fair amount of leeway and that he can be businesslike and do something quite ambitious with China in the hope that, the domestic opposition won't come down too hard on him. So I think it depends. I mean, it's kind of a bit of good cop, bad cop with China, and he'll have some room for bargaining there. And I think recent statements by Jaishankar, we're 75% of the way to where we were before Galwan. I mean, it's a signal that the government thinks it can do quite a bit with China.
Thank you. That gives me a lot to think about as well. My next question is going to be somewhat related to the business aspect about how business with China is something that usually political parties focus on, and foreign policy is usually not that something that they heavily criticize over. So it's just bringing me to the security and economy debate that's coming up with China. And this is also where I'll bring up the idea of non-transparency that you brought up before. So I was just wondering what you think about the growing tensions between the government's security first approach, as well as the industries that are advocating for stronger ties with China, and how this could potentially shape India's foreign policy in the future, especially considering the economic engagement with China continues despite the bans because of Chinese technology and expertise.
Yeah, I think that you've got to unpack this binary of security versus economy, the government on one side and business on the other. What do I mean by that? I mean by unpacking it. I mean, there are elements within the government itself which would take a much more security first approach. And there are other agencies that might be more on the side of we need China economically. The ties to China in the economic sphere are very important. So I think the government itself has different points of view. It's not that the entire government is security first and hostile to an economic relationship with China. Likewise, the business community, there are some who are very opposed to economic links with China because Chinese firms are competitors. So I think your typification of security versus economy and the government on one side and business is not terribly accurate. I don't think it works that way. There are alliances between government agencies and businesses who want a better economic relationship. And there are other government agencies and other businesses that are opposed to an economic relationship. So I think you'll have to be very careful about how you pose the security versus economy debate. And I think it's reflected in the government's stop and go attitude. Stop on some issues of economic interaction and go on others. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, the transparency issue is very important. I mean, so much around China, the relationship with China, going back to the 1940s, has been in such a mist of kind of and the public just doesn't know the history very well. We still don't have basic kind of openings up of the archives, and that continues right to today. And so it's quite difficult for the public to weigh in. I mean, if you want rational policy with public support on an issue, you have to explain stuff, you have to communicate, you have to share information better in a credible way. And as long as you don't, you're not going to get a lot of public support. And I think that does become a problem in trying to deal with China. In the case of India, I mean, China can control information and get away with it, and maybe it's helpful for China and its negotiators. But in India, with an open society, if you don't open up enough, it's a problem. And I think no Indian government, not this government or governments before, have been transparent enough. So, I mean, I would agree with you that transparency will generally be helpful, but no Indian government has been transparent enough on China.
Thank you for your response. I think it's very valid to say that the industries themselves are heterogeneous, and that's on my part to just focus on the industries that are pushing for like engagement with China. But that's interesting that perhaps we can expect a more nuanced government approach to economy, maybe in compared to like past after 2020, when I see, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I see sort of like a opposition to any kind of economic engagement with China. Do you think now, considering that Modi's recognizing in Financial Times that China is important, and there are also a few specific industries that benefit from engagement with China that are also pushing for this, that we can see a somewhat more nuanced approach to China, where it's not like we just block everything, we don't want them to invest in India, we don't want their firms in India, and that kind of thing?
Well, I think even there, one has to be careful. After Galwan, it wasn't a complete termination of the economic relationship. I mean, what the government basically did was ban apps, various kinds. It said there would be greater scrutiny of foreign investment from China, but it didn't stop them, the Chinese, altogether from investing in India. It said that tenders that were out there that the Chinese bid for, with, let's say, Chinese state-owned enterprises, that would receive much greater scrutiny now. But again, it didn't completely ban Chinese participation in, say, construction projects and so on, except in very obvious security areas. So I think even after Galwan 2020, there was a recognition that in certain areas, for instance, APIs, which India needs for its drug industry, most of, I think 70% of the APIs come from China. These are the basic chemicals that go into India's pharmaceutical industry. I mean, India received some supplies from China during COVID of things like masks and oxygen machines and so on, and it sent stuff to China as well. So, I mean, it was never a complete break with China. But yeah, I mean, I think now there's a very different tune. Indian government spokesman, officials, the Prime Minister signaling the need for a resumption, a much bigger economic relationship with China. And trade last year bilateral trade was, I think, the highest it's ever been. India is the 6th largest export destination for China, I think, last year. So the economic relationship is certainly making a comeback, but it never completely collapsed anyway. India was too dependent on China for certain areas, say certain key metals as well. So, it's very difficult for India to break off completely. And I think Mr. Modi sees that the most clearly. And those businesses and agencies in the Indian government who favor an economic relationship with China, going back to my earlier point, they've made a comeback now, and they're pushing for, a more normalized economic relationship.
Thank you for that. I think that gives us a lot and our audience a lot to think about as well. What I wanted to ask you was there's a general perception that overdependence on China is probably not good for security reasons as well. So I wanted to ask your perspective as a researcher who works within security, that whether this dependence on China in the long term, whether we should have policies to reduce it, or whether we should develop some sort of counter interdependence between the two countries where India also develops certain specific exports or certain comparative advantage. For instance, they're slowly trying to get manufacturing, like iPhones, I think around 14% are now being manufactured in India. So just wondering what you would tell to people who are actually worried about the overdependence on China and the fact that, the government wants to start developing a bit more engagement with China as well.
Well, I mean, I think it's always an open question how much economic interdependence influences your policies in the security domain. So I think that's quite a controversial area. It's not a straight line between economic interdependence and security policy decisions. But clearly, I mean, you need to strike a balance. India doesn't want to be completely dependent in certain crucial areas with China. So I think diversifying supplies is important. I think the Indian government's been trying, quite rightly, to diversify, computers, metals, APIs, various kinds of manufacturing products that it buys from China. But I mean, of course, there's pressure from various Indian manufacturers who depend on intermediate products from China to maintain the relationship. So I think that's all to the good, but it's going to be difficult because as many countries all over the world have found out, including the United States, manufacturers at home and consumers depend on cheap, high quality, and very large volume exports from China for their own goods. So this diversification will be quite difficult, it seems to me. On the other hand, India increasing its exports to China. That's a hard one. I mean, basically, India's mostly supplying China with commodities, like a third world country supplying a first world country. We're supplying raw materials to China because our manufacturing is just not, competitive enough. And Indian manufacturers don't supply on time. There's not good quality control. Of course, the Chinese are responsible as well. They have, tariff and non-tariff barriers in crucial areas that they use to block Indian exports. So again, India is trying, and I think the negotiations to get the Chinese to see better sense on barriers. But it's not easy dealing with the Chinese, as everybody has found out. So I would say, I mean, and then the China plus one strategy that you're pointing to, bringing in Apple and so on, I think that's very early days. The countries that have done well out of China plus one are really Vietnam and Malaysia. India's not much of a beneficiary of that. And the reason for that is mostly because even now, ease of doing business and infrastructure problems, Indian federalism gets in the way. Every state has its own kind of, difficulties and problems with imports and setting up factories and so on and so forth. The land acquisition bill gets in the way. I mean, there are just so many difficulties in dealing with India. It's not surprising that most of the benefits have gone to countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and even to some extent Bangladesh, not India in the China plus one. So I don't see this trade gap with China, which is a kind of an estimate of the dependence on China. I don't see that being abridged anytime soon. It's a fact of life we're going to have to live with in India, that it's going to be a long time before Indian manufacturing can get to the point where we can make a good business offer to Chinese importers who look at Indian products and say, oh yeah, great, let's buy from India. They're competitive and quality is good. This is a problem for India and we're going to have to live with it. I mean, the only possibility is trying to diversify our imports, finding others who are competitive, the US or others in different parts of the world. It's going to be very difficult. I think it's a long haul for dealing with China on economic interdependence.
Thank you for that. I think that's a very balanced and insightful perspective for those of our listeners who are interested in economics. So next, I want to move a bit out of the country and bring us to the US elections. And because we're like reaching November soon, I was wondering what you think about the recent US presidential election and whether it has the capacity to influence India-China de-escalation efforts, and whether it could push India or China towards greater confrontation or cooperation, depending on whoever comes in power.
I mean, my sense is that the US elections, keeping the Americans so preoccupied, everyone's watching them very closely in China and India, but it's also uncertain at this moment. Whatever the outcome, I mean, I'm not sure that the US stance on China will change dramatically, whether it's Harris or Trump. But I think the one thing that does strike me is Trump is always the most unpredictable. I mean, in his term as president, he started out being fairly, I mean, he changed a lot. He came in huffing and puffing against China. But on the other hand, when he met Xi Jinping in the US and had that dinner with him, and then he tried to strike a trade deal with Xi Jinping, that showed that he can be quite changeable. Dovish one moment, and then hardline the next moment. But we can't count on Trump. I think, as some people do in India, being very tough on China. He'll do whatever suits him at any given moment. He could be very dovish and transactional with China and strike a deal. Go back to that period with Trump in the White House. He was very uncomfortable with his own allies in East Asia, wagging his finger at the Japanese, at the South Koreans, at others, saying, you've got to pay for the alliance better. Relations weren't great with his allies. That was music to China's ears. He struck a trade deal with China. He often signaled being very transactional with China. I mean, if he came back to power, it's not necessarily the case that he will play along with India. He's just made a statement, in anticipation of Modi's visit to the United States, where there will be a meeting with Trump, saying, India is a kind of serial abuser of free trade. That he likes Mr. Modi, but he doesn't like India's foreign economic policies. So, I mean, he has significant doubts and tensions even with India. So again, I think we'll just have to wait and watch. I mean, let's also remember that Mr. Modi is has been quite moderate with China himself. Whatever different elements of his administration may have said and done about China, I mean, he did famously say just weeks after the fight in Galwan that India has lost no territory. There were no incursions by foreign troops into Indian territory, which is a very dovish statement right at the height of the crisis. He has never once in public criticized China. In all his years, he may have done a few things here and there that would annoy China, but he's never publicly criticized either Xi Jinping or the Chinese. He's gone very slow on the Indo-Pacific, sometimes a bit more positive, and then other times quite lukewarm on the Indo-Pacific with the Americans, the Japanese, and the Australians. So, Modi and Trump might take a very different view of China if Trump came back. They may both be very transactional with China, up to and including quite cooperative. So I don't know. I mean, I think, again, we've got to be very careful about making quick judgments about what the elections may or may not do. Harris may turn out to be quite tough on China, and Trump might be quite dovish and transactional. Likewise, Modi has shown that he can be quite pragmatic with China, even as he allows elements of his administration to be quite tough. So, I mean, I guess the central thrust of most of my remarks is that we have to be very, very careful about the incentives and the constraints on India vis-a-vis China. It's not going to be an easy kind of policy towards China. There will be movements, sometimes more dovish and sometimes the other way. And Indian policy remains uncertain, and quick judgments about, under Modi, India has been so tough against China and all of that. I mean, I think that's total nonsense.
That's very interesting, actually, the leadership styles and how they may or may not be what we expect, especially for Modi being a bit more dovish, as you say, and Harris potentially being tough on China. And with that, I sort of want to bring us to China now, because we've examined a lot of India's leaders, their intentions, domestic obstacles. But I just wanted to, for the last question, talk about what you think may be China's intention with the border issue. If you think there are certain different factors that are motivating China now to resolve the border issue, something that is different from the past, because they seem to be reassessing the consequence of their military actions as well. So just want to conclude a bit with what we think is happening with China.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Of course, there's the transparency issue. Again, we just really don't know what the Chinese mind is. But I think circumstantially, we can make a case for why China maybe, a bit more dovish, or there's a thaw on the Chinese side vis-a-vis India. I think economy is one. I mean, so Xi Jinping has his troubles domestically. Growth rates have fallen off. There's a certain amount of worry about the Chinese economy very clearly. Secondly, on the economy, I mean, India is now, as I said earlier, the sixth biggest export destination for Chinese goods. So that's quite a substantial, chunk of China's exports. And, China will have an eye on trying to take the economic relationship further. Beyond trading in goods, there's the trade, as it were, in capital. So sending investment into India and getting good returns on it. India's a very big market potentially ahead in the years ahead, given its growing population. So I think India is a big economic opportunity. And I think at a time when China's economy is slowing down, I think India rises in economic salience for China. So that's one. I think China has noticed, post the difficulties India has had with Canada over the alleged assassination, and then the American accusation that India might have been plotting an assassination bid there as well against a Khalistani leader, that there's something, a little bit of the shine has gone off the India-US relationship. So I think, China maybe senses a bit of an opportunity there. I made mention also the Indo-Pacific. I mean, there's some amount of talking up the Indo-Pacific in the Indian media that it's all, fantastic and things are happening there, and the defense relationship with the Americans is also doing well. But that assassination episode, while it hasn't blown up altogether with the Western countries, I think there's been unease on both sides about that, and I think perhaps China senses an opportunity to build back, a relationship with India, pull India away from the Western countries somewhat. I think the third is that, I think India's, as I was saying earlier, Modi has held the line against overreacting on Galwan. It's very perceptible. And you see it also, in the fact that willy-nilly, gradually, India has accepted the idea that the Chinese apparently have put forward on the Ladakh sector particularly. That is the idea that there ought to be buffer zones where neither side sends its patrols. Now, that's an idea that India apparently didn't like initially, but over the 4 years since the fight in Galwan, there seems to be evidence that India has more or less accepted the Chinese contention there. So, that's a concession on India's part. So why wouldn't the Chinese pocket that and then try to build a better relationship with India? As I said, I mean, there's been no criticism really of Xi Jinping or China by Modi. And notice one other thing. If listeners haven't noticed it, which is that after the initial criticism of the BRI by India, which is quite forceful, the debt diplomacy of China and so on, over the last 2 to 3 years, there's hardly been a single statement by India criticizing the BRI anymore. So that's music to China's ears as well. That's another concession by India to get China in a good mood. The last point I would say, last couple of points are related to Tibet. Whenever there's a problem between India and China or a bit of a thaw, keep in mind developments around Tibet. And I think China is seeing some difficulties over Tibet. For instance, the Resolve Tibet Act that the Americans have passed recently, which brings into law a statement saying, China should negotiate with the Dalai Lama more, and China's reacted very hard against it. China is cracking down on dissidents in Tibet. So, at this time, China doesn't want trouble from India on Tibet, for instance, as well. The President Dalai Lama is getting older. He will pass from the stage. This is a bit of a tricky transition time in Tibet for China. This is not a time to, I think, also confront India too much. So I think there's that. And lastly, this year is the 75th year of the Chinese Communist Party of being in power in China. So I think, China does not want to get into a scrap with anyone in the 75th year. It wants to be able to say that, China on all fronts is enjoying a wonderful time globally, internally. And so I think there are multiple reasons why, these things work like that. They're kind of all kinds of reasons, conjunctures, not all of them related, that come together, and then policymakers looking outwards, including at India, probably told themselves, this is a time to now maybe loosen up with India. By the way, one other point on domestic politics. There have been significant military problems that the Chinese military has faced. I mean, 2 defense ministers have been sacked. Various military commanders of the rocket force and so on have also been sacked or are under questioning. So there's a bit of an uncertainty in the Chinese military too. Is that a time to confront the Indians also? They've also got their troubles in Taiwan, in the South China Sea, with the Americans. So I think there are all kinds of reasons that the Chinese probably think this isn't a time when, building bridges to India might be a wise move.
That was actually a very interesting analysis towards the end. Thank you so much for that, Professor, for sharing your valuable insights on such an important issue. I'm sure our listeners will greatly benefit from your perspective, especially on the last analysis about China's intentions and motivations and what could be changing now. We appreciate your time and look forward to continuing these discussions as the situation evolves.
Thanks, Kanika.
Thank you. You're listening to the South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates through social media. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and X.